Hello, welcome. It's always fun to start these series of interviews because they are just an informal chat, but we are also aware that a lot of you will be joining us via video at a late stage. So we put in this kind of stilted intro piece in front of each of the videos in the 10 interview series, just so you know what's occurring and what you've actually stumbled across. I think it will be a really interesting and valuable resource. This video today is with Christina of Endeva and their Inclusive Innovation 2030 process, but it's one of a series of 10 that EVPA are creating on our research process for what we're terming a Transformative Finance Lab. So in the words of good podcast hosts, if you haven't listened to the other episodes, please do feel free to visit those. But now we'll just give you a very quick background on why we're doing this process and what we're hoping to get out of it before handing over to Christina for a little overview. So a Transformative Finance Lab is a phrase that we came up with last year after a lot of work with our members, talking about the fact that a lot of these problems that our members are trying to address are really complex and really interconnected. And often there's bits missing in the puzzle, but there's people working in darkened rooms in different places around the world trying to work on these puzzles without often coming together to co-create solutions or share solutions or benefit from what other people have learned. So that's why we've decided to enter into this process, and with the kind support of the Jacobs Foundation, looking to do some work in the start of 2022 around a research process to understand what lab processes are out there at the moment and what we could use to bring to bear on our own Transformative Finance Lab. Somebody on our team had a brilliant idea of making these open interviews so that they can be shared more widely. And actually that is really important to us because it shows the process we're going through. It's an open collaborative process for EVPA, its members and others who want to join us. So if you're watching this video and have some great ideas, please do get in touch and or visit the website at www.evpa.eu.com. The only other thing to give you some upfront information is we'll plan to run this for about 45 minutes. We'll have a chat with an introduction from Christina and then open conversation and question and answers. So there's no need to fast forward, it's only 45 minutes. So without further ado, I suppose just to introduce the other people on the call, you'll see the other members who are working actually on this project at the moment, my colleague Anya, from EVPA, who's based in Berlin, and also possibly joined by Eileen, who's joining us via voice from Berlin as well, I think, from our partners in Endeva as well, alongside Christina, who's our lead. I don't think I've forgotten anything in the intro, but I will just check with my colleague Anya if there's anything else she would like to add. Perfect. Well, with that in mind, I would actually firstly welcome Christina, and then I don't know if Christina, if you could want to take us through a couple of slides just to introduce the process at Endeva.
Yes, happy to. And nice to see Eileen here. So I'm actually here because Eileen said she didn't want to interview herself. Because we created this IR 2030 methodology together, and Eileen is also working alongside with you in the Transformative Finance Lab, where you'll be using some of this methodology. Maybe just for quick introduction, Christina, I'm an economist by training, started working in consulting and have set up together with Eileen Endeva about 15 years ago. And then 5 years ago, we pivoted into working more on system innovations. And that's the work we've been pursuing since. So what I have to share in the couple of slides that I can pull up now is our core methodology, which is called Inclusive Innovation 2030. And I also have a couple of early learnings. So we've been implementing this methodology since 2017. We've done a couple of iterations now. Also, every time we tweaked it a little bit further. We're not at the end, we're still learning. Where do I share? Can I share? Ah, there you go.
You should be able to share. Yes, I gave you some hosting rights.
Yes. Yeah. So looking forward to the discussion and to also get your questions. So what we do at Endeva, we enable system innovations, and we work with partners from all sectors to create the systems that serve people and planet and to transform their own role towards these future systems. So yeah, that's a bit our history working in inclusive business. We've always worked with public sector, private sector, social enterprises, NGOs, academia. And when we looked for our next agenda, we just put this capability up front to work more as facilitators and curators of change. Why we need system innovations, probably I don't need to tell you, but we really need to change very fundamentally how we go about our stuff as humanity. And the good news is we believe we can. We just need to coordinate much better and find better ways to go about system change. Because how we understand system innovations, it's really to change broader systems, not just components or individual business models. We know how that works very well, but we don't know how to get to this disruptive change. There are a few good tools out there. Of course, you need to come at it with a system mindset, and it's all about changing the way different actors interact, and that requires coordination. And that's what we try to bring in with this methodology. So this is the core structure of the IA 2030 process. There are 3 parts: consultation, co-creation, and implementation. So consultation is, we identify often a tech-enabled opportunity for systems change, and we share openly with a group of people what is that opportunity and what holds us back from actually moving there. This is the consultation process, where we also distill where the co-creation opportunity might be. Then we move on into co-creation, where we come up with a smaller group of people with a systemic solution that can be implemented, and then move this into the implementation phase. So the point of IA 2030 is that there's actually something happening on the ground at one point. And you asked in your set of questions, when do you know that you have succeeded? That is the point where we know that we have succeeded, if things are happening on the ground. And I can tell you already, it doesn't always happen because it's a big step from let's come up with something to let's actually do it. But we've learned a little bit already about the success factor for actually getting into this implementation stage. We think of IA 2030 as these 3 ingredients that are coming together to think about a systems change opportunity. First, of course, there's the opportunity itself. There is that emergent future that we can already see, and we know that's where we want to go. Then the second ingredient is to have the right players in the room. Often we have that idea that let's all get together and do something together. In IA 2030, we curate very carefully to make sure that the players that are in the room really have something to contribute and are not just there to have a good time. So we select the players that are relevant and necessary to change the system, from companies, public sector, NGOs, social enterprises, academia, whoever it might be. And then, of course, it's the methodology, where we played around a lot with different ingredients from system practice, theory, design thinking, to come up with something that also works for these different backgrounds. Because as you know, if you are in a public sector organization, you're working at a different speed, you have a different terminology and mindset than if you're coming from a startup. And so, yeah, we try to take people through a process that is comfortable, but also very fast in a way to process that joint aspiration. Yeah, it's essentially this is the standard process. So by now, and after 2 years of COVID, we have a fairly standardized version of the consultation and co-creation phases. Consultation is essentially 2 workshops. Those workshops can be quite large, with up to 50 participants. In the first one, we develop a system map with a system practice. So you might have seen these causal loops that show what are the factors at play and how do they reinforce each other to produce the outcomes that we see in the present system. And from there, in the second workshop, we identify leverage points. And those are then the leverage points, or we select one or several leverage points that we take into co-creation. And for co-creation, we narrow the group of participants to really make sure that for this particular issue, we have the people we need and not more. It's a 3-day co-creation to come up with a prototype, and then that moves into implementation, ideally, as I said. And for implementation, there are typically 2 or 3 partners in the lead that want to really implement, and others are more in a support function. Maybe to make it a little bit concrete, an example from my own work in agriculture. We've done a couple of tracks on how to use the opportunity of satellite data for supporting smallholder farming and helping farmers to professionalize in a way, or to make much more informed decisions, and also be better connected to input and output markets through banks, insurances, and so on. So satellite data holds a lot of promise for all the actors in the agriculture space. And how do we apply it in the smallholder arena? The actors we brought together to explore this potential were data providers, so satellite data providers like Airbus, and analytics companies, outreach organizations that already organize smallholder farmers, service providers like insurance companies and banks. We brought them into the process to explore how might we now actually realize this potential on the ground. And one output was a pilot on insurance that we ran in India, where we basically plugged into the public crop insurance system and tried to make that more attractive for farmers by adding satellite data as a trigger, and also as an information system via their cell phones to educate them about insurance, but also to alert them when they can claim an insurance. We learned a lot during the trial. It's one of the examples where I would say we're not fully successful, because what we also learned is that working in a public insurance scheme is hard work, and there are a lot of things that you can't influence. So, but I'll get back to that in the end. Maybe one more example where we're really moving far ahead with also implementing and scaling up our activities is from the drone space. Again, a tech-based opportunity, using drones as a to, in a way, revolutionize logistics in Africa. These 2 tracks led to the setup of a coalition of partners, the Drones Doing Good Alliance, with some of the partners are here, Airbus, Merck, and Lifebank, that are now collaborating on a continuous basis to embed drones in existing logistics systems, for example, for health, and even more to build a drones industry in Africa and bring public money to the ecosystem. So there's very tangible stuff happening on the ground that resulted from bringing this right set of actors together into the process. So for this track, we had the drone manufacturers, we had Lifebank as a social enterprise who's doing health logistics, we had Airbus as a tech provider, and Merck as a health solutions provider, a pharmaceutical company, and that mix was good enough to see, yes, there's enough opportunity here to move onward together. This is my last slide. So what have we worked over this maybe 10 tracks or so that we've done with this methodology? One thing that is really important is that we have ownership and leadership. In the beginning, we thought, it's great to have this opportunity and to explore it together. But then, of course, it's frustrating if a great idea doesn't move ahead. And that just requires at least one client, so to speak, that really wants to make this change. It's also working much better as a design process in an existing program. So that's currently the way we are using it in some of our tracks. So if there's already a larger framework where multi-stakeholders have decided that they want to pursue a systems change idea together and there are resources for implementation, this methodology works very well as a design process to understand in the beginning the system landscape and to understand what role should each player then take in this collaboration. Yeah, and what we've also learned that it's good to take the step back together. So especially developing a system map together, I think is a really great place to start for people to then collaboratively identify opportunities. But then we need to get concrete very quickly. So we moved away over time from doing too much design thinking and coming up with lots of ideas, because it's not the ideas that are missing, it's more understanding what will our relationship look like, how are we going to collaborate together after this workshop. So moving on to much more theory type stakeholder constellations work to ideally end the co-creation workshop with a very tangible tomorrow, this is what we're going to do work plan, rather than a brilliant idea that still needs a lot of work to get into action. Yeah, so much from me. Hi Farvad, so nice to see you here.
Thank you. That's as well. I mean, no, thank you very much for that, Christina. And it's really interesting to share. I mean, I've got, as you might imagine, quite a few questions. I don't know if anyone else does, but I was just wondering, maybe if you could stop sharing the screen, and we'll, not that I'm going to interrogate you, kind of, but it's always nice to see faces, and then we'll, because I mean, I thought that last piece you mentioned about it being relationships and not just outcomes, but the relationships being really key to the output of this process. It did kind of link into a question I won't lie, I had before this call as well, is you're talking about quite a lot of people going through quite a long process. How are you keeping them engaged, and how do you work on that if for these sort of processes, and is there anything you've kind of learned over the last 10 or 11 tracks that you wish you knew then?
Yes, yeah. So that's a very good question. And we really try to also think this process from a user perspective. It's not, we want, or the client wants this to happen, but what is in it for everyone who participates, because everyone contributes their time. And in the consultation phase, it's very open, and usually people join because they're interested to be part of the conversation. It's more a learning exercise, really. Why, everyone is always asking the same questions, because usually the systems that we want to get to are quite obvious, right? And we all ask ourselves, why are we not just doing it? What's going on here? Why are we still driving these cars around? It's also not such a big time commitment. It's these 2 sessions that are 2.5 hours, 3 hours each. So it's for people, it's more an education thing. They want to be part, and they also want to connect and see who else is there. I think that's the main motivation. And then of course there's already this core that knows that they are going to move on to the co-creation. And then for the co-creation, it really depends. When it's part of a design of a larger project, everybody knows that they will need this immediately for their collaboration. So that's why I think this is the best way to place it, and the incentives are really clear, because it helps people to figure out something that is highly complex in a fairly efficient way. So usually, if you have, like, I'm currently in a process where there's 7-8 organizations trying to figure out how are they going to run a scale-up process. And there's also a lot of risk involved in that design phase. I think everybody who's been doing multi-stakeholder partnerships knows that if you don't see these blind spots in the beginning, they will definitely fall on your feet. So people that know that it's worth investing early on, and it's saving them time. In other setups where we've done it initially, as I said, we've done it a little bit more loosely, just coming at it from the opportunity and let's explore this together. I think there was the motivation was to actually then find partners to implement together, but that was sometimes frustrated just because the resources were then not in place to move ahead immediately. And it's difficult to mobilize resources quickly, even with the greatest idea you might have. You need to do a lot of work to develop it. So we've moved away from this, let's just come up with something and then try to do it. It's just in the end wasting people's time.
Yeah.
If you don't have the proper framing to then directly take it into action.
And would you say on that proper framing and to take it into action, does that translate into kind of actively getting a supporter or a funder of the program as well? So rather than starting from a problem, because we could all come up with a problem at this precise moment, but actually actively searching for client member. And how does that work? Is it a case of they're approaching you, or you're kind of going out and tracking down likely candidates who would be interested in this?
Yeah, so it's now really a service, a design service, I would say, much more than an event or something like that. We get approached by people who see that this is a solution for a problem that they currently have. And it's not that we're doing 10 tracks at the same time, it's not that we are swamped with demand, but it's typically with people who have gone through the process and understand this is how you use it. And this is exactly what I need at the moment. So in another edition that we are currently doing together with the GIZ, it's based on a demand of the Ministry of Transport in Rwanda to implement change around smart cities. Classic systems change problem. If you're talking traffic or waste or whatever, you always have multiple players that you need to coordinate. And so that's also a really great setting. There's a government as a client, there's resources to implement, and then IA 2030 helps to speed up and organize that very fuzzy front end, coming up with multiple players with an idea, what are you going to do?
Okay, and on that, and you may not have an answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway, that around the measurements of success there, because I know you mentioned in the presentation there, it's about things actually happening, which is almost a revolutionary success measure for some, but and we all kind of aspire to that, but there's also this thing about the value that you're adding with the networks and such like that. So when you are dealing with a government in the ministry in Rwanda, are you providing some kind of measures or some kind of thing that values all those other bits as well as the kind of output at the end, if that makes sense?
Yeah, we haven't done that formally, so to speak. I think we've talked about it, and it's a really important point. It's more that we package the outputs along the way, that they also get the system map and they get the list of experts and so on and so forth. I don't know whether that can be seen as a success metric, but there are definitely multiple outputs along the way that are also valuable beyond the actual implementation of the thing. But we don't have a metric system behind IA 2030 yet. Might be good to have.
Well, yeah, but just one thing that's come up from a couple of inches is this kind of thing of all these other added elements of value, but innovation and all these processes are by their very nature quite, they go different places sometimes, and they you need to give them space to move, but it's a challenge to show the value as well of things when you've got to be realistic and know that you're not always going to kind of succeed at the end. I mean, I do have a couple more questions, but I just also think it might be an idea just to open out to say hello to Fabi. Hello. And also, if there's any questions from a colleague, Anya, or anyone else at this point. Otherwise, it feels a little bit like interrogating someone otherwise. That's the only trouble.
Yes, let me come in here. Obviously, thank you so much, Christina, for this presentation and also the discussion. Again, very enjoyable. Fawad, can you tell us a little bit from where you're coming from, with what are your expectations? Then maybe we can involve you better into the conversation.
Hi, my name is Fawad, and I work for a corporate foundation in Pakistan. And we've worked with Endeva. Christina has been, well, I don't know, Christina, I mean, I consider you as more as a mentor rather than, I look forward to, a lot of work that Endeva has done. So, and of course, the type of work, our line of work is in many ways what is being discussed. I mean, even we have our approach towards venture philanthropy also. So I've been not so formally, but been following EVPA's work also, some of the cutting edge discussions that have taken place. So yeah, I mean, very much interested in co-creation and inclusive innovation. And as a practitioner, I have, questions that I would want answers to without necessarily, specific to II 2030, but at a conceptual level.
Yeah. I mean, we're also curious about getting some answers at the conceptual level. You were not there in the beginning when Peter introduced briefly what we were doing, but the whole point of what we're doing here is really to get some answers on some design questions in relation to the Transformative Finance Lab that we are currently designing. And this is why we are interviewing a range of people, including Christina. This is why we also have a range of different questions where maybe we never get some answers to, but already it's helpful to see how different people approach these design questions. So we are on the same page here, Fawad. We are also looking for some, we also have many questions and at the level, and like to get some answers. So you're very welcome to join the conversation and also get more. I also added some links in the chat, which gives you a little bit more information also about the short abstract that Christina submitted as part of the Collab Award we had at the EVPA last year, which really summarizes also a part of the approach.
And Fawad, we talked about II 2030. I think you joined later, but I just presented the II 2030 methodology.
Yeah. I would have a question on the mapping, and I just see that like a miracle, Aline has a similar question, so maybe we can join forces here. The mapping question is something that keeps us awake, not at night, I would say, but at least it's something that we're trying to get our head around. Obviously, you can just start the process by throwing a certain challenge at a certain audience and be very precise about it, and then come up with a solution, or you develop a systems map where you talk about the broader systems, and then you explained about the leverage points. It's a bit more inclusive. It's a bit more, maybe also it requires a little bit more effort to come up with these leverage points and then identify where you can intervene. But I understand the leverage points, or what you're doing with the system mapping, is very much about the solutions already. So it's a first step into the right solutions rather than focusing on the problems and what doesn't work, or would already the problem definition be part of the analysis? That's the first question. And then the second question, to just show you a little bit what we are struggling with at the moment, is that the focus of the Transformative Finance Lab is supposed to be on financing solutions. And we find it quite challenging, or on financing as a means to achieving a certain impact in any way. So we find it quite challenging to know where we start with drawing the system boundaries where we're trying to intervene. Is it about, coming up with a system mapping on the financing opportunities and how to use finance for more impact? Or is really the starting point the broader social challenge that we're trying to resolve? And maybe you have some thoughts about that. Aline, maybe you want to add something on that?
I can. I think you phrased it very nicely. I wrote Anya in the chat that we should use you, Christina, as a thought partner for this. So I tried to phrase it like in a concrete question. When we for our first pilot look at the education system and EdTech, is the question that we ask for the system map: what forces enable or inhibit EdTech to create impact? So kind of trying to find out what are the challenges in the education sector for which we potentially could use finance as a solution? Or is our question rather, how might we, or how might more collaboration in finance ensure that EdTech improves impact? So this is kind of my attempt to phrase it. And this is the nut that we still need to crack, and happy to get your thoughts on this, Christina.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because actually the methodology, how we portray it, misses that first point where we design the thing, and that's a longer process. And it's also the part that's from our end the least structured, I would say, where we started to think about how do we do this in a systematic way. But so oftentimes now it has really been opportunistic, that somebody came with a rough idea and then we spend some time together with the client to shape it up. Actually, in the Rwanda process, they now ran a structured process to co-create also the challenges. Aline and I were not part of that, but might be interesting to peek into that as well, how they've done that. And that's, of course, a big piece of the art if you're using the system practice to frame the question well, because that then defines everything that flows, that comes afterwards. So the question you ask, in our case, in the consultation, drives the whole process until the end.
Yeah,
it's critical that that's the question you actually want to ask. If you ask me just intuitively, narrow or broad, I would say rather make it narrow, because otherwise you will have to somehow scope it again afterwards. So if you start with the broad education sector and map, and this is a huge sector, I mean, it's not even a question, right? Because what are you going to talk about? It's also a challenge then for the system mapping itself, because if your question is not very specific, your map is very generic. And it doesn't tell you a lot.
That's what I mean also with drawing the system boundaries, because depending on how you ask the question, it has a broader or narrow scope, and then you zoom in on a specific question. But if you look more into, the financing part, or if you look more into other mechanisms, other potential leverage points like policy, all this already defines the system boundaries in a way, and it could potentially go in one direction or the other direction. So it seems to me quite critical about how you go about this, drawing these system boundaries, and whether to what extent it benefits from being a collective effort, or whether there is also some benefit of formulating these or drawing the system boundaries in a smaller group and with a core team of people.
Yeah, I think it also ties in with one of the success factors I mentioned, ownership and leadership. Who has a problem here that they want to fix? Who has the energy to move into, to lead the move into that new system? Of course, you're talking about a collective issue, but who feels the pain most, or who wants it most, and then to create the question from that perspective, because then at least you know that you're solving for someone in this group, and then others can follow. But to have that ownership and leadership and work with that thought partner out, what is really the problem we're addressing there. It sounds a little bit maybe because of the way this project was born, there's a rough sense that there's an issue there. Some things don't get funded, but then there's somehow also a solution in search of a problem, right? So we're come up with innovative financing solutions, but for what?
What exactly? Yeah.
What problem are we solving? And probably then that's your first step, to really nail the problem, and then to draw the system map from there and see, then you can ask, why do innovations of these characteristics don't get funding, or why do these types of social enterprises don't get funding? And then in the end, you know that you can also solve that question.
So it's asking the why question 5 times, and then you have your system boundaries, ideally.
Yeah.
Just on that, so just to add to that a bit, but it is asking the why question 5 times, but it's also who you're asking that to. So how, without sending us all down a rabbit hole that will lose us for the afternoon, but is there, like, in your experience in doing this, how have you managed to draw the line where those interested stakeholders are? Because when you're doing projects in, you know, like, you'll have the funder who could be a core or, you know, lead partner and thought partner that's there, but how wide? And something we're struggling with, I think it's fair to say, well, maybe I am actually, I won't claim other people are, but is how much we need to hear wider voices coming into there, because theoretically always, because otherwise you're just going to hear the same things and the same people are going to tell you the same problems, but how do you find that kind of gap, or have you come up with any kind of even intuitive rule of thumb of how far wide you need to go for those sort of stakeholders?
Yeah, so typically we've started with a fairly specific question or idea that we're exploring that suggests the type of players that are needed around the table. And that's why we talk about it as curation, also because we work in spaces that we know really well. I couldn't run a track in mobility. I have no clue about mobility. I can do it in food and ag, where I've been working for 15 years. And I know the players also personally, because it's not just knowing who should be there, but getting the people there and motivating them. That's often more personal, based on personal connection. So right now in this Rwanda example, we brought local track leads from Rwanda on board that have a network again and can bring the right people. And then we have that funnel idea. So it's not that we say from the beginning, these are the 5 people who are going to solve this issue. We have a certain idea and we want to make sure that the people we think are part of the solution, are part of the process. But we also have that openness to be surprised, basically, because we also want to attract people and invite people who have an appetite to contribute and don't run a closed process, because that would also mean foregoing potentially opportunities for the client or the group of people who are innovating together. So that's one of the benefits of the consultation phase. It's very open. We advertise it on LinkedIn. Everybody can join and listen in. And then we might make it quite clear, or actually the next phase, co-creation, is by invitation only. But yeah, I think we've always also identified new players during the consultation phase that we didn't know before.
That's an interesting point, that you then curate the people in the room the later you get in the stage, and maybe you also then accept that at some point people will drop out and maybe then only the core will remain in place. But in the beginning, it's quite open in order to get people in the room that you may not even know about in the first place, because they are basically new to the process.
Yeah, so it's really the stages also in terms of who participates. A few people move on to co-creation, and then even less people move on to implementation. And it's also, I mean, that's also part of the art, that you communicate, like you manage expectations quite clearly, that this is how we're going to, because we don't want to send anyone away formally, right? But we also don't want to allow everyone where we are not sure what's going to be the value add. So it's like these separate packages where it's always clear, this is now your value add for this stage, and then we see what happens next.
Really interesting. I have a question.
Can I just
say something?
Yeah. So Christina, continuing on what you're saying, I mean, in terms of there is, there's a sort of problem that is shared by many, and there are those who are, feel the greatest pain, for example, and will have greater motivation to, come forward. In my experience, those very same people happen to be overestimating a lot of things also. So, for example, type of finance that we try to approach. In our example, for example, we clearly overestimated, the availability of impact first capital, and went on with the, setting up a venture, and later on figuring out that there isn't enough, for example, impact first capital available. And even those people who were sort of partnered with us, saying something and having their own, let's say, definition of having impact first capital, we are into a situation where, all stakeholders have different timelines, different expectations from the venture. It's very much a practitioner problem. How do you discount all of that at design stage? How do you assess, how long this motivation will survive and will remain on a common course and before it takes on, its own, tangent?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Fawad. I don't know I have the answer. The way we try to solve it to make sure that our process works is that we try to have a commitment or try to plug into longer programs that already have, so there's a framework we're plugging into, because we made that exact same experience as you did. In the beginning, somebody can be very enthusiastic, committed, and talk about a lot of resources that can come into the picture, but that in the end it never materializes and there's not much you can do about it. So, so that's why this methodology has transformed a bit into a service, really a service where we are designing for someone as part of a bigger ambition. I think it doesn't suit all systems change or innovation purposes, because you won't find someone like that everywhere. It's just now for us a fix to get out of it, precisely that problem, that you need someone who leads.
Interesting what you're saying. Actually, this is another point I had noted down for this discussion, is the business model. And I know you also raised this as part of our conversation on the Collab Award, and about the difficulties it is if you provide such a service where you, as the intermediary and the facilitator of these co-creation processes, you also have to make sure you can continue to provide that service. And there's obviously also a question of how much revenues are generated, and where the funding comes from to facilitate this process. But so I think there are two questions here, really, to facilitate the process and then also to implement the prototypes that are emerging, or to at least fund the initial ones that the market wouldn't fund, where to just get them off the ground. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience on that?
And maybe that's an opportunity for the Finance Lab, I was just thinking.
We should join forces.
No, but in general, because that is a big gap. And I think, Anya, we talked about this before, no? I mean, funding is not following a systems change logic. It's exactly in that logic of one person has a problem, wants to solve, and therefore can pay for it. That doesn't suit all systemic issues, but we were thinking about this before, and it has nothing to do with IA 2030, but what about competitions or other funding vehicles that fund collaborative innovations? Because often it's that first, and it's often not even very expensive, but if you don't have a base, and not just for facilitation, but just, to provide some infrastructure, do some research, whatever needs to be done for this kind of collective prototyping, it's just not going to happen. And I suspect there's a lot of opportunities that are not happening just because nobody has that drive to put up the couple of 100,000 to move it ahead. But that's why I say for us, we as a business, we moved along with our business logic. How can we ensure that we can provide our service and improve the conditions for success in what we're doing? But we have to leave a lot of opportunities out because they don't fit into that logic. And maybe there's actually a funding opportunity here if you talk about transformative funding.
Yeah, exactly. So the fact that the funding doesn't go only to those who provide the direct impact on the ground, to the end beneficiaries, but also the intermediaries in a sense, that facilitate, bring people together and provide the infrastructure for impact to happen. And that's for sure a funding gap. But also the question is also whether there could be different kind of funding sources for these prototypes. I assume it also has something to do with the incentives for people to remain motivated if they know that they will generate some ideas and come up with some prototypes that have a high likelihood of being funded compared to a situation where people come up with wonderful ideas and then they have to go around and pitch for funding, and it gets really difficult to get your ideas funded, which again then influences the way how people would engage next time a similar process happens, because they would say, we had a wonderful idea, but it is so difficult to get the early stage funding for a new prototype.
Exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that, I mean, the EU always asks for, when they ask for proposals for these multi-party, right? And you need to have all kinds of different players from all of Europe. It's not following a system change logic, but in a way, it's already preparing the ground for collaboration. Mm-hmm. But there are not many funding opportunities like that where you are explicitly requested to come with a transformative idea and multiple players. And then actually this kind of transformative mechanism could again be a service to help people come up with this kind of idea, but then maybe already as part of a longer funding opportunity. I don't know if it's something that you can fix, but I definitely see a gap there in the market.
Yeah. And we are coming back to the question of, who has the problem? Because you said before, it's good that we get a coalition of organizations together that identify a problem that then the co-creation addresses. But often the problem is not on the funder side, but more on the those who create the solution. And I think this is what we were trying to address when we were thinking, okay, let's first map, say, the education system and understand which leverage points there are to do joint intention building amongst funders, to say, okay, if you collaborate on these leverage points, then the impact can be multiplied. This was kind of our pitch. And then also facilitate these collaborations versus looking at what are kind of the financing gap in the system as a question, which then I agree comes a bit more from the funder's perspective. But yeah, when talking about the case of the education sector, I really felt the funders don't have a problem. It's the impact that is not created as we desire. So I just wanted to bring that observation in, and how do we crack that nut is still an open question for me.
It's an interesting perspective on the funders' perspective and what they seek to achieve. Of course, the funders, you would assume they just come in and then they give them money, and actually it's easier to fund a cool social enterprise compared to a collective impact initiative. But if we, and that's a little bit our theory of change, if we were to raise awareness amongst the funding community that in the long term, and if you really want to tackle the root causes of a problem, then you need to raise awareness about the importance of having this systems perspective and how you want to achieve impact. Then the funder will realize, actually my money may be even better spent if I look for transformative impact. And that means if I fund collaborative efforts. So that becomes then part of my investment strategy as such. And that's something we actually hope to achieve also with the Transformative Finance Lab, but also with the other transformative finance activities. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's there's a disconnect, and the question really is, how do you define the actual problem that you want to resolve? It could be a financing problem that you're saying, collaborative efforts in the education sectors, which are needed in order to address the root causes of the education sector, don't attract the funding that they need for. And then you ask the why question again 3 times, and then you've come up with the root causes. So that's a little bit how I see us going about it. But honestly, I mean, we have to.
Yeah, I think also I get that picture of reconfiguring the ecosystem, and I think that applies equally to funding, right? Because every funder has a different offer, has a different intention, has different products for different purposes. that are not aligned. And that's always the discussion in finance. How can it be easier for one investee to move along a spectrum of investment products? But then if you're talking multiple investees in a collaborative project, it's almost impossible. So I was wondering, maybe there's also an issue really at the level of finance, of coming together as a group with the different offers and intentions, and understanding how can we interact more efficiently in order to solve a systemic issue. So every problem in the real world has a reflection in the financial world, right?
Yeah.
And what we've done in the past is try to pool funding through different mechanisms, but we just had this discussion in another project, Aline and I. Pooling funding is a whole nightmare in and of itself, right?
Exactly.
And you've even created a bigger monster than what you had before. So aligning funding, coordinating funding along a process could be much easier from the funder's perspective, but it needs this design up front. What type of funding is needed for what in this, let's say,
exactly.
Let's fix preschool education or something like that in Rwanda. I don't know. There might be real investments in there. There might be grants in there. There might be public money in there. So if you could somehow collaborate between the funding side and the doer side, and figure out how do we as funders need to come together in order to enable the transition in the reality, but not by pooling funding into an education fund Rwanda, but by just knowing, okay, we have this bouquet of financing needs, and this is how we're going to address it as a group.
The one thing that, just very quickly on that, and I don't know if this is relevant, it reminds me, when working with philanthropists, there's always that thing about asking them whether, what is it you want to do? Is it, I want to change the world, or I want to see the world changed? And there's that kind of motivational piece that comes into this, and whether, because the reason funders don't collaboratively work together often is because they have different motivations. And so there is a question there about whether actually the role of the lab is to kind of surface some of those motivations, which could take us down to a completely different kind of pitch and go into deep psychotherapy with some of the funders. But there is there's also an element on the other side of this, is does that suggest that certain audiences are likely to be better placed to do that? Because for being really simplistic, and let's just for a moment be nice and simplistic about this, that the government, for example, public spending, you could go, should have a clearer mandate in that they might want educational outcomes to be improved. Full stop, end of story, discussed. No, but there is that kind of, as opposed to individual funders are, from be it foundation, be it individuals, be it other funders, are always working in a piecemeal, self-motivated drive way. So I just wonder, do you have any thoughts on if there's in that model you're talking about, whether there's a more likely audience that would respond to that collaborative thing or fit better? And that isn't so much a question, it's just a little bit of therapy, so I could get all that out of my head. But that kind of, it feels to me that, yeah, that there should be a group that are more open to this.
The EVPA Transformative Finance community, Peter, that we are creating. That's that is target audience.
Yeah, it's about that. Each of those funders are also not necessarily as tied to collaborative funding or collaborative impact as they are their own goals. So I wonder if there's an audience that we should think about as being ahead on this and wouldn't have those challenges.
Yeah, I don't know whether that helps in the end. I think it's also completely, I think because you're not talking only about organizations, you're also talking about individuals, and definitely everyone will have their own motivations and intentions in there. And that's what these processes are for, to align behind a shared goal and understand the individual goals and make sure they get heard and seen. And typically the pitch is that you can achieve your individual goals better if you are part of the group. So that's where the art is, to find that opportunity. And now that everyone is talking about systems change, maybe there is an opportunity to rapid test or even just float such an idea with a group that's already very much into thinking about systems change from a finance perspective, and what is really the issue there, because I guess it's not just like I'm thinking of what were they called? Silvia Bastante.
Oh,
co-impact.
Co-impact. Someone like that who's done thinking on funding for systems change, what they've observed and what they think is missing. But I could see a fantastic role for EVPA in this space to provide it as a service, just organizing collective impact, but on the financing side, getting understanding where people have shared agendas for funding and shared agendas for transformation, and then enabling them to coordinate their funding so things actually move.
I mean,
that's the frustration I think everyone in the impact space has, that you can push as much as you like, but if you're the only one pushing in that system map, the loops are still going to go their way and nothing is ever going to change.
But I think this is so this is why I quoted this from Otto Scharmer's book, From Ecosystem to Ecosystem Awareness. I think it's this ability to look beyond, your own project investment strategy and really see what's out there. It's just a very simple example is the way we do startup funding or entrepreneurship funding overall. And then you look at maybe you say the startups have a funding problem, but then you forget that actually a startup goes through an entire life cycle. And then you wonder a little bit, where is actually the greatest funding gap? Is it in the beginning or is it later on? So if you don't open up your perspective, then maybe the startup that you're funding in the beginning will not get the venture capital finance that they need in the second and third and fourth stage. You will also not have the desired impact. I think this ecosystem awareness overall is quite interesting. And this is why I think the system mapping tool as such is such an important tool. Yes. But of course, for an organization such as EVPA, the challenge is always, and that's maybe another aspect, and I see we have to come to an end now, but the challenge that we have is from the abstract level of making it relevant to all our members and the community, the broader finance community, and then really having a very specific case like you do in Rwanda, which is then sponsored by one organization. So it's really a matter of tying the abstract level of resolving a broad education finance challenge, tying this together with making it as concrete as possible so that it does actually have an impact on the ground. And if you facilitate these initiatives, this is really important, because at the end of the day, people want to see that impact on the ground if they engage in this lab process, I assume.
Yeah. Are you also talking to Tom Silas as part of your interview series?
Yes, well, not as part of the interview series as such, but yes, he's completely on my radar screen. You mean with the ecosystem approach? Yeah, exactly.
There we had more the other side of that reality. We were focusing very much on changes on the ground in an ecosystem, in a country, in a sector that needed to happen, and that was working very well, but we didn't have the financial part of it, and there would have been a lot of opportunity as part of these processes to bring in different types of funding, because there's the startup need, there's
exactly,
the
and then
need,
the corporate needs, exactly, and the question, how do they all fit together? And effectively, it's really in terms of the size that Fawad mentioned earlier, and it's the nature of capital as well that needs to fit, and the intentions and the investment strategies and so on. So the demand and supply side of the impact finance markets.
Yeah, and maybe that could also be, I mean, that would be great, but it would make it even more complicated. That was Tom's aspiration, and in the next iterations, we have the funders also as part of the process. And sometimes maybe, we always think of it as the finance world as the real world. Maybe sometimes it's easier to do it all in one go. And funders are directly part of the process when we talk about ecosystem development. Financing needs appear along the way, and then
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And there are different kind of financing. I mean, even your initiative also needs some financing, huh? And the facilitators need financing, but it's a different one from the startups that we are thinking about, and it's all part of the same ecosystem. Now, unfortunately, we have to close this conversation, but I was just to wrap it up. If you have 2-3 more minutes to I would like to come back to the question that Peter asked in the beginning about your learnings over the 11 tracks that you have developed, and really just in an essence, what would you say were the main adjustments that you've made over time, from the first track that you've led to the 11th track, and what further changes do you think will be necessary in the future in order to maximize your impact?
Yeah, a couple of changes I mentioned already in the beginning. So not focusing so much on ideas, but on relationships. I think a big one. Then also, the work we've done on how do we embed this properly, that we talked about a lot. How do we improve conditions of success, funding, leadership, and so on. How do we actually see this product ourselves, and how do we pitch it? What is it for? And then in the beginning, it was more this co-creation, and then we've done a lot of work on the consultation, which I think has done a lot of good, both for really understanding the problem and getting the right players involved. And I think what we have ahead of us is still doing more around how do we move into implementation, but also this first phase that we talk about, how do we identify the issue more systematically? What is that?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, thank you for summarizing all these discussions. Wonderful way to end it. Peter, anything from your side, or Aline, any reaction to be able to release Christina from being grilled by
No, just to say thank you as well, because as always with these conversations, you go in thinking one thing, and by the end of it, I'm now really happy because you've just thrown another few random things into my thinking that I thought I'd already all come to a conclusion on, and now have to go and rethink, which is great. But yeah, no, it's really positive and really so thank you very much for that. I don't know, Eileen, if you've got anything.
Many questions still, but thank you, Christina. We should use you as a thought partner.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was fun. More brainstorming than interview, which is more fun, I think. And thank you, Farvad, for joining. It's been nice to see you here. Let's catch up. Are you an EVPA member, Farvad?
Yes. No, not yet.
And you can probably expect some mail.
Okay, sure.
Yes, well, thank you also for joining us and contributing with your ideas. And Christina, yeah, I mean, the doors are always open. We have good contacts with Aline being part of the team. So I think we really would benefit from some brainstorming when we come to the drafting of the first design. I think it would be really nice to have you a little bit of giving us your thoughts on some of the critical questions.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Thank you so much.
All right.